The dark secret history of America's most powerful mansion. Biltmore Exposed. Winter, 1895. A house that swallows the horizon. 4 acres of stone and secrecy under one roof. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces burning coal pulled from the earth by hands you'll never see. Beautiful? Yes. But beauty is a mask. Behind the carved oak doors, beneath the polished marble floors, inside walls thick enough to hide anything, lies a truth they don't print on postcards. A truth about power, about control, about the invisible architecture of American aristocracy. This is not the story they tell you on the guided tour. This is the story of who really built Biltmore. Who paid in blood, sweat, and silence. The workers whose names were erased. The women whose labor vanished into laundry rooms and coal cellars. The financial machinery that turned mountains into money and money into monuments. This is the story of how one family wielded wealth like a weapon. How they shaped a region, controlled a workforce, and constructed not just a mansion, but a system. A system designed to make power look like elegance, exploitation look like employment, domination look like progress. And there's more. Secret financial partnerships, hidden labor abuses, a forestry empire that displaced communities, political connections that bent laws, tax strategies that avoided millions, and a transformation from private palace to public spectacle that rewrote history itself. Who really owns Biltmore's story? Who decides which truths get preserved and which get buried in the basement alongside the boiler ash? Can a house built on inequality ever be neutral? Can beauty erase injustice? And what happens when we stop asking how much a mansion costs and start asking who paid the real price? If you want to see beneath the surface of America's grandest estate, if you want the investigation they hope you never find, stay with me. This story goes deep, and once you see what's hidden, you can't unsee it. Let's expose Biltmore. Christmas morning, 1895. Snow settles on the Blue Ridge Mountains like powdered sugar on a wedding cake. The air smells of wood smoke, pine sap, and something else. Something harder to name. The scent of arrival. Of ambition realized. Of power made visible. Beyond Asheville, North Carolina, past forests that stretch for miles, a private road climbs. Iron gates, taller than 2 men, block the entrance. A guard checks credentials. Only the approved may pass. The road curves upward through cultivated woodland, designed to build anticipation, to make the approach feel like a pilgrimage. And then, the reveal. Biltmore rises from the hillside like a transplanted piece of Europe. Limestone walls, quarried in Indiana and hauled across state lines. Steep slate roofs imported from Vermont. Towers and turrets catching winter light. Gothic revival meets French Renaissance. 4 acres under one roof. The largest privately owned house in America. Then, now. Forever. Numbers try to capture magnitude. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, each with hot and cold running water, a luxury most Americans in 1895 couldn't imagine. 65 fireplaces, everyone requiring daily cleaning, daily stoking, daily attention from hands you'll never see in the family photographs. A banquet hall with a ceiling that soars roughly 70 feet, high enough to swallow sound, to make human voices feel small. A library holding approximately 10,000 volumes, some so rare only a handful of copies exist. Leather-bound, gold-embossed, shelved in carved oak that took craftsmen months to complete. An indoor swimming pool, a bowling alley, a gymnasium. Elevators, still rare in 1895, powered by electricity generated on-site. Central heating from massive boilers that burn coal by the ton. Refrigeration. Fire alarms. Call buttons set into the woodwork so that a gentle press summons a servant from the hidden corridors where staff move like ghosts. Stand in the entrance hall and look up. Stone climbs for 3 stories. A barrel-vaulted ceiling, carved and painted, soars overhead. Polished marble underfoot, Italian, carried across the Atlantic in ship holds. Stained glass, filtering winter daylight into pools of amber and blue. A tapestry on the wall, woven in the 16th century, depicting a hunting scene. Nobles on horseback chasing deer through a forest. They owned the way George Vanderbilt now owns these mountains. The architecture is staged, every angle calculated to overwhelm, to announce without words that you have entered a realm of extraordinary wealth. This is not a house. This is a declaration, but declarations require resources, and resources require extraction. To understand Biltmore, you must first understand the Vanderbilt fortune. And to understand the Vanderbilt fortune, you must understand how American capitalism really works. Not the mythology taught in schools, the machinery underneath. George Washington. Vanderbilt II was born in 1862 into the wealthiest family in America. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, built a transportation empire that changed the nation. Steamships first, then railroads. He understood what others didn't. Control transportation, and you control commerce. Control commerce, and you control everything. The Commodore was ruthless. He undercut competitors until they collapsed. He bribed legislators to secure favorable routes. He manipulated stock prices, buying low, selling high, destroying fortunes with strategic timing. He fought legal battles with bottomless resources, grinding opponents into submission through sheer financial endurance. When he died in 1877, his fortune was estimated at $100 million. In today's currency, adjusted for economic growth, that's approximately $200 billion. Richer than Bezos, richer than Musk. The richest American who ever lived. But here's what they don't tell you on the Biltmore tour. That fortune was built on other people's labor. Thousands of railroad workers, many of them immigrants, Irish, Chinese, Italian, worked 12-hour days for wages that barely covered food and shelter. They laid track in freezing winters and scorching summers. They blasted through mountains with unstable explosives. They died in accidents, cave-ins, derailments, and when they died, they were replaced. No safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no unions, because unions were crushed with hired security and political influence. The Commodore understood power. And power, in Gilded Age America, meant owning not just the means of production, but the system that protected it. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died, he left almost everything to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. William doubled the fortune within a decade. How? The same way. By controlling transportation, by buying legislators, by ensuring that government policy favored railroads over farmers, industry over labor, capital over people. Treasury. They owned railroads that stretched from New York to Chicago. They owned steamship lines that crossed the Atlantic. They owned real estate in Manhattan, factories in upstate New York, coal mines in Pennsylvania. George Washington Vanderbilt II was the youngest son. He inherited approximately $10 million outright, plus income from trust funds. In today's terms, that's roughly $300 million in direct assets, and tens of millions more in annual investment income. He would never work a day in his life. He would never have to. But George was different from his brothers. While older siblings built palaces in Newport, threw parties that cost $200,000 for a single night, raced yachts, and competed for social dominance, George disappeared into books. He was shy, soft-spoken, uncomfortable in crowds. He spoke 8 languages. His passions were art, literature, horticulture, forestry. He collected rare books with the intensity others reserved for racehorses. He traveled constantly, mostly to Europe, studying architecture, visiting great estates, absorbing how the European aristocracy used land and buildings to project permanence. By his mid-20s, George had decided on something unusual for a Vanderbilt. He didn't want a showpiece for entertaining. He wanted a retreat, a private working estate, a place to read, think, manage forests scientifically, and live quietly amid beauty and order. The question was, where? In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother. The town lay in a valley ringed by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was cool, clean, free of the industrial smoke that choked northern cities. The scenery was dramatic. Peaks, ridges, rivers cutting through ancient stone. The Southern Railway had recently extended service, making Asheville reachable without making it crowded. George was captivated. But more than that, he saw opportunity. The land was cheap. The region had been logged carelessly. Forests cut and abandoned. Farmland exhausted by tobacco and corn, then left to erode. Nobody wanted it, which meant George could buy it for almost nothing. He began acquiring land in 1888, not a modest plot. Thousands of acres, parcels accumulated steadily. Farms, wooded hillsides, eroded fields, exhausted ground. In time, his holdings exceeded 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than many European principalities. He paid an average of $5 to $10 per acre. For roughly $1 million, he assembled an empire. But here's what the official history glosses over. That land wasn't empty. People lived there. Families, mostly poor, white, Appalachian families who had farmed and hunted those mountains for generations. They didn't hold formal titles. Many couldn't read or write. They lived by subsistence farming, growing what they ate, hunting deer and turkey, cutting timber for their own cabins. When George Vanderbilt's agents arrived with deeds and lawyers, those families were displaced. Some were paid small sums. Others were simply told to leave. The power imbalance was absolute. A poor mountain family with no legal representation versus Vanderbilt lawyers backed by infinite resources. There are no detailed records of how many families were removed. The Biltmore archives don't feature those files prominently. But regional historians estimate dozens of households, perhaps more than 100 individuals, were pushed off land their ancestors had occupied. Where did they go? Into deeper hollows, onto worse land, into Asheville to find work. Some, no doubt, ended up working for George Vanderbilt himself, building the very mansion that displaced them. This is the foundation Biltmore rests on, not just limestone blocks. Dispossession. George's vision was ambitious. He wanted a house that married European architectural grandeur with modern American technology. He wanted the estate to be productive, farms to produce food, Forests managed scientifically to yield timber sustainably, a model of enlightened stewardship. On paper, it sounded noble. Scientific forestry, modern agriculture, employment for the region. Progress. But progress for whom? George hired the best. Richard Morris Hunt, America's leading architect, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed Central Park. Together, they would transform a scarred mountain plateau into a vision of old-world elegance. The initial budget was reported at $5 million for the house alone. In today's terms, over $150 million, but that figure, like so many official numbers, is misleading. The real cost was far higher when you include land acquisition, infrastructure, the private rail spur, worker housing, forestry programs, and years of operating expenses before the estate generated revenue. Conservative estimates place the total investment by 1900 at $10 to $12 million. Adjusted for inflation, approximately $350 to $400 million. And that was just the beginning. To build Biltmore, George needed labor. Lots of it. At the project's peak, more than 1,000 men worked on the hill. Stonemasons, carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, electricians, plumbers, laborers to haul stone, mix mortar, dig trenches, clear debris. The workforce was diverse but stratified. Skilled craftsmen, Italian stonemasons, brought specifically for their expertise in carving and setting limestone, earned top wages, perhaps $4 to $5 per day. 50 per day, 50 per day. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. No overtime, no benefits. If you were injured, you were finished. No workers' compensation. No medical care beyond basic first aid. Women worked too. They staffed the estate kitchens, feeding the construction crews. They worked in laundries, washing the workers' clothes, thick with stone dust, coal ash, and sweat. They cleaned temporary housing. They were paid less than men. Perhaps 50 to 75 cents per day. Children worked. Boys as young as 12 or 13 hauled water, carried tools, swept floors, ran messages. They earned pennies. Their labor was invisible then. It's invisible now. The human cost is hard to calculate. The work was dangerous. Stone dust damaged lungs. Pneumoconiosis, silicosis, diseases we now recognize were unnamed then. Men coughed. They tired. They died young. Heights were unforgiving. Falls from scaffolding killed. Crushed hands. Broken backs. Equipment failures. A cable snaps. A block of limestone swings wild. Accidents happened. Records are sparse. The Biltmore archives don't catalog worker deaths prominently. Regional newspapers occasionally mentioned incidents. But no comprehensive list exists. No memorial. No names preserved. The official history celebrates the craftsmen, Italian artisans, skilled woodworkers, the artistry they left behind. And their work deserves recognition. The carving, the joinery, the precision. It's extraordinary. But what about the men who mixed the mortar, who hauled the stone, who dug the foundations in winter cold? 25 daily wage home to families living in one-room cabins? They built Biltmore too, and they vanish from the story. George Vanderbilt understood architecture. He understood horticulture. He understood literature and art. But did he understand the lives of the men who built his palace? He visited the site regularly during construction. He inspected progress. He approved designs. Did he see the men as individuals? Did he know their names? Did he visit the bunkhouses where they slept? Did he ask about their families? There's no evidence that he did. This is not to say George was cruel. By the standards of his class and era, he was considered benevolent. He paid on time. Wages were competitive for the region. He provided housing. He didn't tolerate obvious brutality from foremen. But benevolence within an unjust system is still injustice. George could build a $5 million house because his grandfather exploited railroad workers, because his father manipulated markets, because the system protected wealth and punished labor. And the system wasn't neutral. It was designed by men like the Vanderbilts, through political contributions, through lobbyists, through control of newspapers, through social networks that ensured judges, legislators, and governors came from the same clubs, the same families, the same schools. This is the machinery under Biltmore, not just stone and mortar. Power. Part 2. The Architecture of Control. How mansions enforce class. By 1890, construction was underway. The plateau above the French Broad River swarmed with activity. Hundreds of men moving like ants. Stone rising course by course. Timber framing taking shape. The skeleton of something vast emerging from the mountain. Richard Morris Hunt's design was intentional in every detail. The house would be 175,000 square feet. Larger than most public buildings, larger than many European palaces. It would announce, without ambiguity, that George Vanderbilt commanded resources ordinary people couldn't comprehend. But size alone wasn't enough. The design had to communicate hierarchy, to create spaces that reinforced class distinctions, to build, quite literally, the architecture of control. Let's start with the entrance. Visitors approach through 3 miles of winding road. The approach is designed by Frederick Law Olmsted to feel like a journey into another world. Trees frame the view. Vistas open and close in sequence. The road curves just enough to obscure the house until the final moment. Then, arrival. You step down from your carriage beneath the porte cochere, a covered entrance that shelters you from weather. Servants wait to take your coat, your hat, your gloves. You don't speak to them. You hand over your things, and they disappear. You step into the entrance hall. The space is designed to overwhelm. Stone walls climb 3 stories. A massive fireplace dominates one wall. Carved oak, polished to a high sheen, lines the walls. A grand staircase, wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast, climbs upward. Light pours through stained glass. Tapestries, centuries old, hang from iron rods. A chandelier, bronze and crystal, hangs from a ceiling so high it feels like a cathedral. The message is immediate. You are small. This place is large. The man who owns this commands more than you ever will. But the entrance hall serves another function. It's a sorting mechanism. If you're a guest of George Vanderbilt, a social equal, you'll be escorted to the public rooms, the library, the banquet hall, the music room, spaces designed for leisure and display. If you're a tradesman, a vendor, someone here on business, you'll be redirected. Not upstairs, not into the family areas. You'll be taken to a service entrance, a side door, a different part of the house entirely. And if you're a servant, you'll never use the main entrance at all. This is the genius of Gilded Age architecture. It doesn't just house people. It organizes them. It creates physical pathways that enforce social boundaries. Let's follow a servant through Biltmore, You wake before dawn in the servants' quarters, a narrow room, barely 10 feet by 10 feet, shared with another maid, 2 iron beds, a washstand, a single window. The walls are painted institutional green. The floor is bare wood. No rug, no decoration. Functional, spare. You dress quickly. A uniform provided by the estate. Black dress, white apron, white cap. Regulation. Everyone looks the same. Individuality is not encouraged. You descend a narrow staircase, not the grand staircase visitors use. A servant's stair, tucked into the walls, designed to be invisible. Narrow, steep, lit by a single bulb every 20 feet. You reach the basement, a labyrinth. Long corridors painted the same green. Bare bulbs. Pipes running overhead. The sound of machinery. The boilers. Massive, room-sized, burning coal to heat 250 rooms. The laundry. Industrial washing machines pounding away. The kitchens, already full of cooks preparing breakfast. You report to the housekeeper. She assigns your tasks for the day. Clean the library. Dust the banquet hall. Change linens in the guest bedrooms. Scrub the bathrooms. You climb the servants' stairs again. Emerge on the first floor. But you don't walk through the grand rooms. You stay to the edges. You move quickly. You keep your eyes down. If you encounter a family member or guest, you press yourself against the wall. You don't speak unless spoken to. You enter the library. The room is vast, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, approximately 10,000 volumes, a carved oak ceiling, a concealed spiral staircase to an upper gallery, leather chairs, a massive desk, Persian rugs. You start with the fireplace, remove yesterday's ashes, carry them in a bucket, lay new kindling, stack wood, sweep the hearth, polish the brass tools, check the mantel for dust. Then the books. Dust each shelf, carefully. Some of these volumes are worth more than you'll earn in a lifetime. One mistake, one dropped book, one torn page, and you could be dismissed without reference. It takes 2 hours to properly clean the library. Then you move to the next room, and the next. By noon, your back aches. Your knees hurt from kneeling to scrub floors. Your hands are raw from lye soap. Lunch is in the servants' dining room. 20 minutes. You eat quickly. Bread, soup, whatever the kitchen has left over, then back to work. The bathrooms are the worst. 43 bathrooms, each with tile floors and walls, porcelain fixtures, bathtubs, toilets, sinks. Everything must be scrubbed, polished, made spotless. No water spots, no soap residue, no fingerprints. You finish around 7 p.m., 12 hours. You return to the servants' quarters. Exhausted. You eat a small dinner. You fall into bed. Tomorrow you'll do it again, your wage per month. Room and board included. Which sounds reasonable until you realize room and board means that narrow shared room, basic food, and no freedom to leave. You work 6 days a week. Sundays off, unless there's a special event, in which case you work. If you save every penny, never spend anything on clothes or personal items, you could accumulate $180 per year. In today's currency, that's roughly $5,500 for 72-hour weeks. Now let's follow George Vanderbilt through the same day. He wakes around 8 a.m. in his private bedroom. A spacious room, 15 by 20 feet, large windows overlooking the mountains, a 4-poster bed with imported linens, a private bathroom with hot water always available. heated by those basement boilers you stoked. He rings a call button. Within minutes, a servant appears, a valet. The valet has already laid out clothes for the day. He helps George dress. George doesn't choose his own clothes. The valet does, following unspoken rules about what's appropriate for the day's activities. George descends the grand staircase. He enters the breakfast room. The table is set. Silver, china, crystal. A servant stands ready. George sits. Food appears. Eggs, bacon, toast. Fresh fruit from the estate's greenhouses. Coffee, hot, poured without asking. George reads the newspaper. The servant stands silently. When George finishes, he leaves the plate. He doesn't clear it. He doesn't think about who will wash it. He simply leaves. He walks to the library. The fire is already burning. The room is warm. He doesn't know that you spent 2 hours cleaning this room before dawn. He settles into a leather chair. He reads. He makes notes. He writes letters. Lunch appears at 1 p.m. He didn't order it. It simply arrives. Soup, a sandwich, wine. He eats. He returns to his book. In the afternoon, he might walk the grounds, inspect the forestry operations, review plans with Olmsted, meet with his estate manager to discuss finances. Dinner is formal. Even if it's just George and Edith, his wife, the table is set with multiple courses. Servants bring each course. Clear each plate, pour each wine. George and Edith talk quietly. They don't acknowledge the servants. The servants are furniture, functional, invisible. After dinner, George retires to the library or the music room. He reads. He listens to music. He might write in his journal. By 10 p.m., he's ready for bed. He rings for the valet. The valet helps him undress, lays out night clothes, turns down the bed. George sleeps. His day required perhaps 1 hour of actual decision-making. The rest was leisure. Reading, walking, thinking, made possible by dozens of people working 12-hour days to ensure that his environment remained perfect. This is the architecture of control. The house enforces it. The design makes it inevitable. George never sees the boiler room. He never enters the servants' quarters. He never walks the narrow, dim corridors where staff spend half their waking hours. Those spaces are hidden, deliberately. Because if the wealthy had to confront the machinery that sustains their comfort, the illusion would shatter. The house is designed so that labor is invisible until it's needed. Press a button, a servant appears. Finish a meal, the plate vanishes. Sleep, and wake to a fire already burning. This isn't an accident. This is the point. Gilded Age mansions like Biltmore are machines for producing inequality. They concentrate resources. They enforce hierarchy. They normalize exploitation by making it elegant. And they do one more thing. They erase. Walk through Biltmore today as a tourist. You'll see the grand rooms, the art, the furniture, the chandeliers. You'll hear about George Vanderbilt's refined taste, his love of books, his scientific forestry. But you won't hear much about the servants. You might get a brief mention, maybe a glimpse into the servants' hall, but you won't learn their names. You won't see photographs of them. You won't hear their stories, because their stories were never recorded. Their labor was never valued as history. This is architectural erasure. The house preserves what the powerful want preserved, and erases the rest. Part 3. The Forestry Empire. Displacement as Progress. The house was George's retreat, but the forest was his mission. By 1891, the house was rising, stone and timber climbing into the mountain air. But George's attention was elsewhere. Beyond the formal gardens, beyond the manicured approach, the wider estate troubled him. Decades of logging and careless farming had stripped the land. Hillsides were scarred. Creeks ran brown with silt after every storm. The native forests, once dense with American chestnut, oak, and tulip poplar, were fragmented and exhausted. George wanted more than a handsome view. He wanted a productive, scientifically managed forest. Proof that enlightened stewardship could heal abused land while generating revenue. Timber sales could help offset the estate's crushing operating costs. But George had a problem. In America, forestry as a profession barely existed. Europe, especially Germany, had practiced scientific forest management for generations. America had loggers. The difference was fundamental. Logging extracted and moved on. Forestry managed for the long term. George consulted Olmsted, who recommended a young American just back from European training, Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was 26 when George hired him in 1892. Ambitious, idealistic, eager to prove that European forestry methods could work in America. He surveyed the estate and saw both disaster and opportunity. The land was damaged, but 125,000 acres offered room to experiment on a scale no other private landowner in America had attempted. Pinchot's approach was systematic. First, a full inventory. What species were present? Where were healthy stands? Where was natural regeneration taking hold? Which areas were most degraded? The survey took months. Crews walked every tract, marking trees, measuring diameters, logging health assessments. Then came management decisions. Pinchot introduced selective cutting. Instead of clear-cutting hillsides, crews would harvest mature trees, leaving younger growth to climb into the canopy. This maintained forest cover, reduced erosion, and protected future yields. He laid out fire breaks. He launched reforestation, planting thousands of seedlings. White pine, yellow poplar, oak. He hired local men to plant, thin and conduct controlled burns. He cut roads and trails to reach remote areas. He kept meticulous records. The Biltmore Forest became a laboratory. Practices refined here would shape American forestry for decades. But here's what the official history downplays. Scientific forestry wasn't just about trees. It was about control. Before George Vanderbilt arrived, those 125,000 acres weren't wilderness. People lived there, not in towns, not in formal settlements, but scattered families, subsistence farmers, hunters, foragers. They used the forest in ways that didn't fit scientific management models. They hunted deer, turkey, bear. They gathered ginseng, a valuable root they could sell. They cut timber for their own cabins, fences, firewood. They grazed livestock on open hillsides. They moved seasonally, following game and weather. This was their way of life. It had been for generations. When George bought the land, that way of life became illegal. Not because laws changed, because ownership changed. What had been common use, informal, unwritten, but understood, became private property. Trespassing, poaching, theft. Pinchot's forestry program required enforcement. Guards were hired. Local men, ironically, paid to patrol land their neighbors once used freely. If someone was caught hunting, they were arrested. If someone cut timber, they were prosecuted. If someone gathered ginseng, they were fined. The legal system backed George. He had deeds. He had lawyers. The displaced families had neither. Some accepted work on the estate, low-wage labor, planting trees, clearing trails, building fire breaks. The same land they'd once used freely, they now worked for $1 per day. Others resisted, quietly, poaching at night, cutting timber from remote corners, small acts of defiance. But the power imbalance was absolute. George had resources, legal authority, and patience. Resistance was futile. Over time, the human presence faded. Families moved deeper into the mountains or into Asheville to find work. The land emptied of people. And as it emptied, the official story changed. The people who lived there disappear from the narrative. Their displacement becomes invisible. Their loss becomes progress. This is the dark side of conservation. When it's done by the wealthy, on land taken from the poor, conservation becomes another form of control. George Vanderbilt genuinely believed in scientific forestry. He admired European models where aristocratic estates managed forests sustainably for centuries. He wanted to bring that to America. His intentions, by his own understanding, were good. But intentions don't erase harm. Pinchot left Biltmore in 1895 to take a federal post. He would eventually become the first chief of the United States Forest Service. Biltmore had been his training ground. He replaced himself with Carl Schenck, a German-trained forester with both academic rigor and field experience. Schenck continued the program and expanded it. In 1898, he founded the Biltmore Forest School, the first forestry school in America. Students lived on the estate and learned by doing, marking trees, calculating timber volumes, laying out roads, conducting prescribed burns, studying soils, diagnosing tree diseases. The school ran for 15 years. It trained hundreds of foresters who carried scientific management across the country, into state agencies, into federal programs, onto private timberlands. This is Biltmore's most lasting legacy. Not the house, the forestry program. But legacies are complicated. Scientific forestry improved land management. It reduced destructive logging. It protected watersheds. It sustained wildlife. These are real benefits. But it also centralized control. It displaced traditional users. It redefined proper use in ways that favored industrial timber production over subsistence living. It created a professional class, foresters, who spoke a technical language that excluded local knowledge. The men who'd lived on that land for generations, who knew every ridge, every spring, every animal trail, their knowledge was dismissed as ignorant, unscientific, backward. Schenck's students learned to see forests as resources to be managed, optimized, made productive. They didn't learn to see forests as home, as community, as life. By 1910, the Biltmore Forest was visibly recovering. Erosion slowed. Reforestation plots matured. Wildlife returned. Timber sales provided steady revenue. George's vision, on its own terms, had succeeded. But at what cost? How many families lost access to land they depended on? How many hunters lost their primary source of meat? How many ginseng diggers lost income they used to buy flour, cloth, shoes? The official records don't say. The Biltmore archives don't catalog those losses. Regional newspapers didn't cover them. Those people weren't newsworthy. They were poor. White, mostly, but poor. And in Gilded Age America, poverty was invisible unless it became a problem for the wealthy. And the people who lived there disappeared. This pattern repeated across America. As conservation movements grew in the early 20th century, as national parks and forests were established, indigenous peoples and poor rural communities were displaced. Their land was taken, often by force, and redefined as wilderness. Biltmore was a model for this process, proof that private wealth, combined with scientific expertise and legal authority, could transform land, could erase one way of life and replace it with another, and it was celebrated. Gifford Pinchot became a national hero. Carl Schenk's school was praised. George Vanderbilt was admired for his foresight. The displaced families were never mentioned. This is how power works. It doesn't just control resources, it controls the story. It decides who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. And once the story is set, once it's written in archives and repeated in tours and taught in schools, it becomes truth. But truth and justice aren't the same thing. Part 4. The Invisible Workers. The Women Who Vanished. Construction took 5 years. By Christmas 1895, the house was ready. The public rooms gleamed. The guest bedrooms were furnished. The kitchens hummed with activity. The boilers roared. The lights glowed. Biltmore was alive. But a house this size doesn't run itself. It requires a small army. At full operation, Biltmore employed well over 100 people. Some estimates push it to 120 or 130. The exact number varied seasonally. The workforce was stratified. At the top, highly paid specialists, the estate manager, the head gardener, the chief engineer responsible for electrical and heating systems. These men earned $100 to 100 terms, $50 per month, substantial wages for the era. Below them, skilled staff, cooks, butlers, valets, housekeepers, coachmen, chauffeurs as automobiles arrived, carpenters, blacksmiths, plumbers, men almost exclusively. They earned $40 to $80 per month. At the bottom, maids, laundresses, kitchen workers, scullery maids, dairy workers, women almost exclusively. They earned $10 to $20 per month. Let's talk about the women. They are almost entirely missing from the official history. Walk through Biltmore today, and you'll hear about Richard Morris Hunt's architectural genius, about Olmsted's landscape vision, about George's refined taste, about the Italian stonemasons. You'll hear almost nothing about the women who scrubbed the 43 bathrooms, who washed the mountains of linens, who cooked the meals, who cleaned the fireplaces, who made the house function. Their labor was essential. Without it, the house would have collapsed into filth within days. But their labor was invisible. By design. Let's reconstruct a day in the life of a housemaid at Biltmore in 1900. You wake at 5 a.m. Winter, still dark. Freezing cold in the servants' quarters. No heat up here. Heat is for the family rooms. You dress quickly. Your hands are stiff, chapped, split from lye soap and cold water. You descend to the basement. The kitchens are already operating. Cooks arrived at 4 a.m. to start breakfast. You grab a piece of bread and a cup of weak coffee. You eat standing. By 5:30 a.m., you're in the family wing. Your first task, fireplaces. You move room to room. Rake out yesterday's ashes into a bucket. Carry the bucket. It's heavy. Ashes from 65 fireplaces accumulate. Dispose of them in the ash pit behind the house. Return. Lay new kindling in each fireplace. Stack wood. Sweep the hearths. Polish the brass tools. Check the mantle for dust. It takes 2 hours to do the fireplaces properly. By 7:30 a.m., your back aches. Your dress is smudged with ash. Your hands are black. No time to clean up. Next task. Bedrooms. You start with the guest rooms. Strip the beds. Carry the linens. Heavy down to the laundry. Return with fresh linens. Make the beds. Hospital corners. No wrinkles. Fluff the pillows. Smooth the coverlets. Dust every surface. The dressers, the nightstands, the windowsills, the picture frames. Sweep the floors. Check for anything out of place. 8 guest bedrooms. 3 hours. By 11 a.m. you're exhausted. But there's no break. Next task? Bathrooms. This is the worst. 43 bathrooms. You won't clean all of them. You're assigned 6, but 6 is enough. Scrub the bathtubs. They're porcelain. Heavy, deep. Reach in, scrub. Your knees on tile. Cold, hard. Scrub the toilets. Scrub the sinks. Scrub the tile walls. Scrub the tile floors. Every surface, spotless, no residue, no water spots, no hairs. Polish the brass fixtures. Make them shine. Empty the waste bins. Refill the soap. Replace the towels. Each bathroom takes 30 minutes. 6 bathrooms, 3 hours. By 2 p.m., you're allowed a break. 20 minutes. You eat in the servants' dining room. Leftover soup. Bread, you sit. Your feet scream. Your knees throb. Your hands are raw. Then back to work. Afternoon tasks vary. Today, it's the library. Dust the books. All 10,000 of them. Well, not all. But dust the shelves. Carefully. Use a soft cloth. Don't damage the bindings. Some of these books are worth more than you'll earn in your lifetime. Dust the furniture. The tables. The chairs. The lamps. Sweep the floor. Check the windows for smudges. 2 hours. By 5 p.m., you're assigned to help in the dining room. A dinner party tonight. 8 guests. The table must be perfect. You help set it. The china, the crystal, the silver. Each piece placed precisely. The housekeeper checks. She's exacting. If something is wrong, you do it again. The guests arrive at 7 p.m. You stand ready. As each course is served, you help clear. Carry plates to the kitchen. Return with the next course. You don't speak. You don't make eye contact. You're invisible. Dinner lasts 3 hours. By 10 p.m., the guests retire. You clear the table completely. Carry everything to the kitchen. The scullery maids wash. You dry. You put away. By 11 p.m., you're finished. 18 hours. You climb the stairs to your tiny room. You fall into bed. Tomorrow, you'll do it again. Your wage, 15 dollars per month. Room and board included. Let's break that down. $15 for roughly 26 days of work. 6 days a week, 12 to 18 hours per day. That's roughly 60 cents per day. Roughly 5 cents per hour. In today's currency, adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $450 per month. For 300-plus hours of backbreaking labor. And room and board means a shared 10 by 10 room with no heat and basic food. You don't get to choose what you eat. You eat what the kitchen provides. Leftovers mostly. If you get sick, you don't get paid. If you're injured, you're fired. No workers' compensation. No health insurance. No retirement plan. If you get pregnant, you're fired immediately. Dismissed without reference. No questions about the father. Even if the father is a male staff member. Even if the father is a family member or guest. You're gone. This was common. Wealthy men, their sons, their guests, they had access. They had power. Maids had none. If a young woman caught the attention of a man above her station, she had no recourse. If she resisted, she could be fired. If she complied, she could be fired anyway, once the consequences became visible. How many young women working at Biltmore faced this? The archives don't say. These stories weren't recorded. They were shameful, not to the men, to the women. If a maid got pregnant, she was sent away. Maybe back to her family, if they'd take her. Maybe to a city where she could disappear. Maybe to one of the institutions where fallen women were confined, punished, and exploited further. Her name would be removed from the estate records. She'd be erased. This is the reality behind the elegance, behind the polished marble and carved oak, behind the guided tours and the glossy brochures. The women who made Biltmore possible were worked to exhaustion, paid subsistence wages, and erased from history. But let's go deeper. Who were these women? Where did they come from? Most were local, daughters of poor mountain families. Some were the same families displaced when George bought the land. Pushed off their farms, they had few options. Domestic service was one. Some came from further away. Young women from rural counties across North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, drawn by the promise of steady wages. $15 a month sounded good if you were desperate. They arrived at Biltmore, often as teenagers, 16, 17, some younger. They signed contracts. They were given uniforms. They were trained by the housekeeper. The rules were strict. No visitors. No men in the servants' quarters, ever. No leaving the estate without permission. No personal items in the public areas. No speaking unless spoken to. No sitting in the family areas, even when they were empty. You could clean a chair, but never sit in it. If you broke the rules, you were fined. Money deducted from your already tiny wage. If you broke the rules repeatedly, you were dismissed. Control extended beyond working hours. Your free time, Sunday afternoons and evenings, was limited. You could walk the grounds, but not far. You could attend church in Biltmore Village if you were given permission. But you were always watched. The estate was small. Everyone knew everyone. Gossip traveled fast. If you were seen with a man, a local boy, someone from Asheville, you'd be questioned. Who was he? What were his intentions? The housekeeper and estate manager saw themselves as surrogate parents, protecting your virtue. Really, protecting the estate's reputation. If you wanted to leave, to take a job elsewhere, you needed a reference. Without a reference, you couldn't get hired anywhere reputable. The estate controlled your future. This is what labor looked like at Biltmore. Not employment. Control. And the women who lived it, who gave years of their lives, who damaged their bodies with repetitive strain, with cold, with exhaustion. They left almost no trace. The Biltmore archives have payroll records, names and wages, but no personal letters, no diaries, no photographs of the staff, except a few formal group shots where maids stand in rows, faces blurred, uniforms identical, individuality erased. We don't know their stories. We don't know their dreams. We don't know what happened to them after they left. They are the invisible women of Biltmore, and their invisibility is not an accident. It's a choice made over and over. By George, who didn't see them as individuals. By the estate managers, who recorded wages but not lives. By historians, who focused on architecture and ignored labor. By the modern tourism industry, which sells elegance and erases exploitation. To recover their stories would require excavating what wasn't written, oral histories from descendants, regional records, church registries, cemetery plots, small traces. It would require asking uncomfortable questions. How many women were assaulted? How many were dismissed while pregnant? How many suffered injuries that disabled them for life? How many died young from diseases contracted in cold, damp servants' quarters? These questions have answers, but the answers are buried, and powerful institutions benefit from keeping them buried. Part 5. The Financial Web: Taxes, Trusts, and Hidden Wealth. By 1910, Biltmore had reached a kind of equilibrium. The house functioned. The forests produced revenue. Farms generated food and income. The estate employed hundreds. It looked stable, but the balance was delicate. Operating costs were enormous, approximately $250,000 per year, roughly $7 million in today's currency. Farm and timber revenues covered perhaps one-third. The rest came from George's investment income. George had inherited wisely. His wealth wasn't just sitting in a bank. It was invested, diversified. Railroads, real estate, industrial stocks, municipal bonds, managed by financial advisors in New York. This is where the story gets murky, and deliberately so. The Vanderbilt fortune, like all Gilded Age fortunes, was structured to avoid taxes and scrutiny. Trusts, holding companies, offshore arrangements. Legal, technically, but opaque. George's personal finances were private. No public accounting, no transparency. He owned Biltmore through a complex web of entities. This made it difficult for outsiders, tax authorities, creditors, to assess his true wealth. Why does this matter? Because the official story presents Biltmore as a personal passion project, George's private retreat. But personal projects don't employ 130 people and operate on $250,000 annual budgets. That's an enterprise, a business, with assets, liabilities, and stakeholders. But it was structured to avoid the regulations that governed actual businesses. No shareholders, no public reporting, no labor protections, because domestic service was exempt from the few regulations that existed. This is how the wealthy operate. They create private structures that mimic public enterprises in scale, but avoid public accountability. George benefited from systems designed to protect wealth. The tax code in 1910 was minimal. No federal income tax yet. That wouldn't arrive until 1913. Estate taxes existed, but were easily avoided through trusts that passed wealth across generations without triggering taxes. Property taxes existed, but they were local, negotiable, and often influenced by personal relationships with local officials. George paid property taxes on Biltmore, but the assessed value was almost certainly lower than the actual value. Why? Because assessment methods were crude, and because wealthy landowners had leverage. If George disagreed with an assessment, he could hire lawyers. He could appeal. He could tie the county up in legal battles for years. County officials knew this, so they assessed conservatively. This is systemic. Wealth protects itself through legal complexity and political influence. Now let's talk about 1913. The 16th Amendment was ratified, creating a federal income tax. Rates started low, around 1% for most earners, but climbed quickly for top incomes. By 1916, the top marginal rate was 15%. By 1918, it was 77%. For George, this was a shock. For the first time, a significant portion of his investment income, the money that kept Biltmore running, went to the federal government. The careful balance of income versus expense tipped. Operating costs didn't fall, but available income shrank. George began adjusting. Travel was curtailed. New purchases were deferred. Maintenance was triaged. He believed he could navigate through. He didn't get the chance. For medical consultations, complications from appendicitis, surgeons operated in emergency. George Washington Vanderbilt II died on March 6, 1914. He was 51 years old. His death triggered a new crisis: estate settlement. When someone as wealthy as George dies, the estate goes through probate. Assets are valued, debts are paid, taxes are assessed. What remains is distributed according to the will. George's will left everything to his wife, Edith, for her lifetime, then to their daughter, Cornelia. Simple, in theory, but the execution was complex. Estate taxes, though lower than today, still applied. Legal fees, administrative costs, and the valuation itself was contested. How much was Biltmore worth? The house, the land, the art and furnishings? George had invested approximately $10 million building and operating the estate. But what was it worth on the open market? Who would buy a 250-room mansion in rural North Carolina? The market for such properties was non-existent. Appraisers lowballed the value. This benefited Edith. Lower valuation meant lower taxes. But it also meant less liquidity. If she needed to raise cash, selling Biltmore for anything close to its construction cost was impossible. Edith inherited an asset-rich, cash-poor situation. The house was worth millions, on paper. But it generated little income and demanded enormous expense. She hired accountants and lawyers. They reviewed the books. The picture was grim. Annual operating costs hovered around $250,000. Revenue from farms, dairy, and timber covered roughly one-third. The remainder had always come from George's investment income. That income still existed. George's estate was substantial. But after taxes and settlement costs, the available cash flow was reduced. The arithmetic was brutal. At the current pace, Edith would exhaust liquid assets within a decade. Once cash was gone, creditors and tax collectors would move. The estate could be seized and auctioned. Edith had a choice: liquidate everything and live comfortably elsewhere, or fight to preserve Biltmore. She chose to fight. Her first move: sell land. In 1915, Edith opened negotiations with the federal government. The United States Forest Service wanted large tracts for national forests. Biltmore's 125,000 acres, already under scientific management, were ideal. The process was slow. Surveyors, appraisers, lawyers, congressional appropriations, politics. The sale closed in 1916. Approximately 86,700 acres transferred to federal ownership for a price reported at around $5 per acre. Total, roughly $433,500. In today's currency, approximately $11 million. A substantial sum, but far less than George had invested in purchasing and improving the land. Why did the government get such a good deal? Leverage. Edith needed cash. The government knew it. They negotiated from strength. Take it or leave it. Edith took it. She had no choice. The cash retired debts and created a cushion. The sale also ensured that George's forestry work would continue under federal management. The land became Pisgah National Forest. But here's what's rarely mentioned. That sale was a transfer of public wealth to private hands, then back to public hands, at a loss. George had bought the land cheap because poor families couldn't defend their claims. He invested Vanderbilt money, built from exploited railroad labor, into improvements, then sold it to the government, funded by taxpayers, many of them the same working-class people whose labor built the Vanderbilt fortune. The poor paid twice, once when they lost the land, again when their taxes bought it back. This is how wealth extraction works. The wealthy buy low, sell high, and the public absorbs the loss. Edith also cut operating costs. Staff shrank from 130 to roughly 60 through attrition and layoffs. Unused wings were closed. Maintenance was deferred. Formal gardens were simplified. She managed tightly, reviewed accounts monthly, questioned every expense. The goal was lean survival. Through the 1920s, the strategy worked. Bills were paid. The house was maintained, if not lavishly. Cornelia grew up, married, and started a family. Then came 1929. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Investment income collapsed. Dividends dried up. The cash flow Edith relied on turned uncertain. At the same time, the local economy imploded. Asheville, which had boomed in the 1920s as a tourist destination, went bust. Banks failed. Hotels closed. Unemployment soared past 20%. Edith faced another crisis. Income down. Expenses still high. Further cuts possible, but there was a floor. Below it, the house itself would begin to fail. She considered selling. But who would buy in a depression? The house was unsellable. Then someone suggested opening Biltmore to paying visitors. For Edith's class, the idea was scandalous. Privacy was sacred. But Edith was pragmatic. She'd already sold most of the land. She'd cut staff. Opening the doors was the next logical step. And it offered something more. If Biltmore drew tourists, Asheville's economy would benefit. Hotels would fill. Restaurants would reopen. People would work. In March 1930, Biltmore opened to the public. Admission, $1, tours covered the principal rooms. Private family quarters remained closed. The revenue was modest but meaningful. More important, the model worked. Biltmore had found a new purpose. Not a home, a museum. But here's the hidden financial story. Opening to tourism allowed Edith to reclassify Biltmore. It wasn't just a private residence anymore. It was a business, which meant different tax treatment. Operating expenses could be deducted. Losses could offset other income. The wealthy don't just adapt. They optimize. Every change is structured for maximum tax advantage. This is legal. It's also how the system is rigged. Ordinary people pay taxes on every dollar. The wealthy structure their affairs so that expenses, losses, and depreciation reduce taxable income to almost nothing. Biltmore continued this model. As tourism grew, the estate became more profitable. But profit is complicated. On paper, the estate might break even or even show losses. High operating costs, depreciation on historic assets, reinvestment in infrastructure. Meanwhile, the family retains ownership. The asset appreciates. When eventually sold or transferred, that appreciation is taxed at capital gains rates, far lower than income tax rates. This is how generational wealth persists. Not through income, through assets that appreciate tax-free until realized. Biltmore today is privately owned by George Vanderbilt's descendants. It's not a nonprofit. It's not a public trust. It's a private, for-profit business structured as a corporation. It draws over 1 million visitors annually. Admission is approximately $70 to $90 per person, depending on season. Revenue from tickets alone exceeds $70 million per year. Add the winery, hotel, restaurants, shops, events, and total revenue likely exceeds $150 million annually. Operating costs are high. Staff of 2,000. Maintenance, utilities, marketing. But the enterprise is profitable. Estimates suggest profit margins of 10% to 20%, generating $15 to $30 million in annual profit. That profit goes to the Vanderbilt descendants, private citizens, benefiting from an asset built with Gilded Age wealth on land taken from poor families, with labor-paid subsistence wages now sustained by tourism promoted as cultural heritage. This is the financial web. Wealth compounds, systems protect it, and the public pays to visit what their ancestors built. Part 6. The World War II Secret, Art, Power, and National Myth. December 1941. Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. Tourism stopped almost overnight. Gasoline rationed. Rubber scarce. Civilian automobile travel nearly impossible. The visitors who'd carried Biltmore through the Depression vanished. Edith faced financial catastrophe again. Then an unexpected offer arrived. Needed to protect its collection. Fears of bombing or sabotage in the capital. The gallery sought a secure site inland to house its most valuable works. Biltmore met every requirement. Inland, secure, controlled climate, vast rooms, stone construction, largely fireproof, private, gated, reachable by limited roads, easy to monitor. Negotiations proceeded quietly. In 1942, shipments began. Trucks arrived at night bearing wooden crates stenciled only with numbers. Guards accompanied them. Crates entered through service doors, carried to secure rooms, chiefly the music room and several large upstairs bedrooms. The contents were extraordinary. Reportedly, works by Rembrandt, Raphael, Vermeer, Gilbert Stuart, including Stuart's iconic portrait of George Washington, the image on the $1 bill. Paintings worth, in the aggregate, millions. Security was discreet. Armed guards patrolled in civilian clothes. Staff understood something important was stored. They were told not to discuss it. The arrangement lasted through 1944. The government paid rent. Not a fortune, but reliable income while tourism had ceased. Federal guards secured the estate at no cost to Edith. The art survived the war unscathed. Biltmore proved its worth as guardian. But here's what the official story glosses over. This wasn't charity. This was a business arrangement. The government needed space. Edith needed income. It was transactional, and it served another purpose. It elevated Biltmore's status. The house wasn't just a Gilded Age relic. It was a national resource, trusted to protect American culture. This is how the wealthy rehabilitate their image. Through association with national interests, by aligning private assets with public good. After the war, the National Gallery retrieved its collection. Crates loaded, trucks departed, rooms were emptied, cleaned, restored. Biltmore reopened to tourists. But now, with a new story. The house that protected America's art. The estate that served the nation in crisis. It's a compelling narrative, and it's true, but it's also strategic. By tying Biltmore to national heritage, the family secured something more valuable than rent. They secured justification. Why should a private family own America's largest mansion? Because they're stewards, guardians, serving the public. This framing matters. It shapes how we see Biltmore, not as a monument to inequality, but as a cultural treasure. And once that framing is established, challenging it becomes difficult. Criticize Biltmore, and you're criticizing American heritage. This is how power protects itself, by wrapping itself in the flag. Part 7. The Modern Illusion. Tourism as Historical Erasure. The post-war years brought growth. Automobile travel resumed. The middle class expanded. Americans took road trips. Biltmore's tourism grew. Edith died in 1958. Her grandson, William Cecil, took control. He understood that survival required professionalization. Biltmore couldn't function as a private home occasionally open to callers. It had to operate as a business. Changes arrived through the 1960s and 1970s. Tourism was refined. Visitor facilities improved. Marketing grew sophisticated. The estate began hosting events, weddings, conferences, seasonal festivals. The winery, launched in 1985, added revenue and a reason to visit. Farm products were sold directly to guests. Expansion was strategic. Maximize income. Minimize wear. Preservation became systematic. The copper roof required repair. Limestone needed conservation. Interior oak was refinished. Electrical and plumbing systems were modernized discreetly. The work was painstaking and expensive. Specialized craftspeople were recruited. Materials matched originals. Every project began with research. By the 21st century, Biltmore drew over 1 million visitors annually. The estate employed approximately 2,000 people. It stood among the region's largest private employers. The transformation was complete. Biltmore began as one man's private refuge. It survived through adaptation, and it became a tourism juggernaut. But here's what modern tourism erases: the history of how Biltmore came to be. Walk through Biltmore today. Take the tour. You'll hear about George Vanderbilt's refined taste, his love of books, his scientific forestry, the architectural genius of Richard Morris Hunt, the landscape vision of Frederick Law Olmsted. You'll see the grand rooms, the art, the furniture, the breathtaking craftsmanship. But you won't hear much about the workers who built it. You might get a brief mention, a glimpse into the servants' hall, presented as quaint. You won't hear about the families displaced when George bought the land. You won't hear about the subsistence wages paid to laborers. You won't hear about the women who scrubbed bathrooms for $15 a month. You won't hear about the workers who died during construction. You won't hear about the tax avoidance strategies, the land sale that transferred public wealth to private hands and back at a loss, the financial structures that shield profit from taxation. You won't hear about the system that made Biltmore possible, the exploitation, the inequality, the machinery of power. Instead, you'll hear a carefully curated story, a story of vision, elegance, and stewardship, a story that presents Biltmore as a gift, a treasure, something to be grateful for. This is historical erasure, not through forgetting, through selective remembering. The modern tourism industry at Biltmore is sophisticated, professional. The guides are knowledgeable and enthusiastic. The preservation work is genuine. The estate is maintained to the highest standards. But it's still a business that profits from packaging history in a way that's comfortable, inspiring, marketable. And uncomfortable truths aren't marketable. If the tour lingered on the workers who died, if it detailed the displacement of poor families, if it examined the financial exploitation, if it questioned whether one family should own such a place, visitors would leave uncomfortable, disturbed, angry, maybe. And uncomfortable visitors don't spend money in the gift shop. They don't book weddings. They don't return. So the story is shaped, smoothed, made elegant, just like the house. This isn't unique to Biltmore. Every historic house, every museum, every heritage site faces the same tension. Tell the full truth. Risk losing visitors. Tell a partial truth. Preserve revenue. Most choose partial truth. And over time, the partial truth becomes the accepted truth. It's what's taught in schools, written in books, repeated in media. The workers disappear. The displaced families disappear. The exploitation disappears. And all that remains is beauty, elegance, heritage. This is the modern illusion, that we can separate beauty from the system that created it, that we can admire craftsmanship without acknowledging exploitation, that we can celebrate vision without confronting cost. But we can't. Not honestly. Every stone in Biltmore's walls was set by hands paid subsistence wages. Every carved oak panel was shaped by craftsmen who slept in rough bunkhouses. Every acre of restored forest was land taken from families who lived there. The beauty is real, but it's not innocent. And the story we tell about Biltmore, the story we tell about all Gilded Age estates, shapes how we understand wealth and power today. If we accept that the wealthy deserve their mansions, that their vision justifies their extraction, that beauty erases harm, then we accept the system that creates inequality. But if we insist on the full story, if we name the workers, the displaced, the exploited, if we examine how fortunes are really built and preserved, then we challenge the system. And that's dangerous to power. Conclusion: the real price. So who really paid for Biltmore? The workers who built it. The families displaced from the land. The women who scrubbed and cleaned for subsistence wages. The railroad laborers who built the Vanderbilt fortune. The taxpayers who bought back the land. The tourists who now pay admission to visit what their ancestors built. How much did Biltmore cost? In dollars, approximately $10 to $12 million between 1888 and 1900. In today's currency, roughly $350 to $400 million. But the real cost is incalculable. Lives damaged, communities disrupted, histories erased, systems reinforced. Biltmore is magnificent. It's breathtaking. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The preservation work is commendable. But magnificence built on exploitation isn't neutral. It's not just art. It's evidence. Evidence of how power works, how wealth extracts, how systems protect the privileged and erase the vulnerable. Can beauty make you immortal? George Vanderbilt believed it could. He built a house meant to last forever, and in a sense, it has. Biltmore endures. His name endures. But immortality has a price, and George didn't pay it. Others did. The question for us now is this: what do we do with that knowledge? Do we accept the official story? Do we admire the beauty and ignore the cost? Do we visit, pay admission, buy souvenirs, and leave feeling inspired by American ingenuity? Or do we ask harder questions? Who benefits from preserving Biltmore as it is? Who profits from the tourism? Who decides which stories get told and which get buried? Is it possible to honor the craftsmen without celebrating the system that exploited them? Can we appreciate the architecture while condemning the inequality it represents? Can a house built on injustice ever serve justice? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're urgent, because Biltmore isn't history. It's present, it's operating, it's profitable, and it's privately owned. Every ticket sold, every dollar spent, flows to the descendants of George Vanderbilt, people who did nothing to earn that wealth except be born into the right family. Is that fair? Is that just? American capitalism says yes. Inheritance is sacred. Property rights are absolute. Success is rewarded across generations. But maybe it's time to question those assumptions. Maybe it's time to ask whether immense wealth, built through extraction and exploitation, should be allowed to compound indefinitely. Whether one family should own a 250-room mansion on 8,000 acres, while others struggle to afford rent. Maybe it's time to imagine a different future, one where places like Biltmore are genuinely public, not just accessible for a fee, but owned collectively, managed as heritage, with profits reinvested in the community, not funneled to private heirs. Maybe it's time to tell the full story, to name the workers, to honor the displaced, to acknowledge the harm, not to destroy Biltmore, but to reframe it, to make it a site of reckoning, not just admiration. Maybe that's how beauty serves justice, by refusing to let us forget the cost. If this investigation made you think, if it challenged what you thought you knew about Biltmore, I need your help to keep this work going. This kind of deep research takes time. Weeks of digging through archives, reading regional histories, tracking down sources that don't make it into official narratives. It's not easy, and it's not popular, but it's necessary. Hit the like button if you want more investigations like this. Real history, not the sanitized version. The uncomfortable truths that powerful institutions hope you'll never ask about. Subscribe to the channel, because there are dozens more stories like this. The Breakers in Newport, Hearst Castle in California, Lyndhurst on the Hudson. Every Gilded Age mansion has a dark side. Every fortune has a body count. And I'm going to expose them all. Drop a comment and tell me which mansion to investigate next. Which estate do you want me to tear open? Which family's secrets should I uncover? Your voice matters. This is our history, not theirs. Share this video. Send it to someone who loves history, who visits these places, who needs to see beneath the surface. The algorithm won't push content like this. It's too controversial, too uncomfortable. So I need you to push it, manually, person to person. And if you really want to support this work, check the description for ways to contribute directly. No ads, no sponsors, just independent investigation funded by people who believe truth matters more than comfort. These houses aren't just buildings, they're monuments to a system that's still operating, still extracting, still erasing. But we can change that by refusing to accept the official story, by demanding the full truth, by remembering the workers, the displaced, the exploited, by asking over and over until it becomes impossible to ignore. Who really paid? And what do we owe them? Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for caring enough to question. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to uncover. And I'm not stopping. Let's expose them all.